Hello. For this week's class session, we're going to be looking at the impact of domestic violence on children. You'll notice that I have shared some resources with you on the class page with regards to domestic violence and the impact of it on children. Those are resources that my hope is that they will be helpful for you. I would encourage you to save them or to print a copy, because you never know when you're going to need a resource like that to access for an upcoming assignment or for your work as a child life specialist in the hospital if you're in a unit where you're responsible for having printed materials available for families. So just something to think about for the future. So we're going to be looking at the impact of domestic violence on children. Domestic violence is oftentimes interchanged with what's known as interpersonal violence. And so for the purposes of our conversation today, you will hear me refer to domestic violence and interpersonal violence for our conversation. So interpersonal violence is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against a person or group that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. Again, as I mentioned, it's also known as intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence. This occurs when an individual purposely causes harm or threatens the risk of harm to any past or current partner or spouse. There's an estimated 6% to 15% of women that have experienced domestic violence in the past 12 months, with a lifetime prevalence estimated at 28% to 54%. So tactics used in interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence can be physical, sexual, financial, verbal, or emotional in nature against a partner. It can also include stalking, terrorizing and blaming, hurting, humiliation, manipulation, and intentional isolation from social supports in the family. And IPV can vary in frequency as well as in severity. Interpersonal violence is associated with numerous long-term effects, both physical and mental, and it can cause an increase in the use of healthcare-related services. So with domestic violence, children are often the hidden or silent victims, and some can be directly injured, while others, we may not necessarily see the scars. They may be emotional, psychological, mental, and so they may be frightened witnesses as a result of what they have seen. Children within these situations are exposed to just a lot are exposed to a lot of just very damaging events and circumstances. And children with this exposure are more likely to have also experienced emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse, and community violence. And we have to understand that abuse can affect families and communities across generations, and can also occur across the lifespan, from dating teens all the way to elderly couples. So unfortunately, this is to say that no one's really immune to this happening. And so there's not like this cookie cutter picture of what this looks like, because it can occur across the lifespan from, adolescents, teens, all the way to the elderly. Now we're going to take a look at domestic violence and the law. Now, protection of women from domestic violence came to the forefront during 2005 with the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, and this was intended really to provide a more effective means of protection of the rights of women, and it was then guaranteed under the Constitution. So IPV is now identified as a significant legal and public health issue. It's not just a private family problem. And historically, what we've seen is that people said, oh, that's for them to deal with, let that family deal with that. But now we understand that it has farther reaching effects on society than, just the family, and that we need to step in and intervene, that it is public health issue. And so as a result of this, there are laws in every state that now address domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Again, we understand, in our conversation about the lifespan, that abuse occurs in all types of relationships and across the lifespan. It also occurs among people with varying backgrounds of age, race, religion, financial status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and education. And we also know that there are certain populations that are at an increased risk for domestic violence. That includes those that may associate with different sexual orientations or gender identities, and because they're oftentimes ridiculed and have challenging relationships within their families, and sometimes you have teens that are kicked out of their houses because of their orientation or identity. And as a result of this puts them in a position where they may be at an increased risk for domestic violence. Although the majority of victims of IPV are women, it's important to acknowledge that men can be victims too, and that this does affect members of the LGBTQ community, and that they also experience an increased barrier to assistance from community resources and police. Now, victims of domestic violence are protected under both federal and state laws, and they can seek relief in both civil as well as in criminal court. Some of the reactions of children to domestic violence include generalized anxiety. They may just be, again, in that hyper state of arousal where they're just always waiting to see when the shoe is going to drop and where that perpetrator is going to become violent, because they know that it can happen at the drop of a hat. They may also experience sleeplessness because they're afraid to go to sleep. They're afraid of what they're going to wake up to, and maybe they had an experience where the violence spilled over into their bedroom, and so they're afraid to be at a disadvantage and be asleep when the blow is going to come or when the violence is going to happen, and so they're afraid to go to sleep. They may also experience nightmares, in that once they go to sleep, they're reliving or revisiting, re-experiencing the trauma that they've had, and so we may see that happen as well. They may have difficulty concentrating in school, again, because we understand that trauma can affect the individual. It affects their brain, their cognition, their memory, their attention, and that it's not uncommon for them to exhibit signs that are pretty close to what would be regularly known as attention deficit disorder. But we know now that some of these children that were previously diagnosed with attention deficit were actually experiencing trauma-related symptoms because of their life experiences. They may also have high activity levels and may exhibit increased aggression, again, going back to that regulation of emotions and ability to regulate behavior as a result of experiencing trauma, and this complex trauma if the domestic violence is repetitious. And so this has the potential then to cause them to act out. It may be because they're having a difficult time regulating their emotion. It can also be because this is what they've seen manifested in the relationships in their environment. And so aggression is common or the norm for them. And so they may not know that this isn't the norm and that there are other ways to respond. They can also have an increased anxiety about being separated from their parent because they're worried about what's going to happen when they're separated. So this increased anxiety or worry because they want to be able to protect their parent if they can, or they're afraid that if they get home, what if this time the beating is so severe and I'm not there to call, 911 or to help my mom or to help my dad. And so they have this increased anxiety and intense worry. So some of the effects that we see because of some of what we see here in terms of their reactions, we see it play out in our classrooms. We see it play out in our hospitals where they may have a poor performance, again, because they're having a difficult time with focusing, with concentrating, with memory, paying attention. They have this impaired ability, which is related to, again, their ability to focus, changes in their brain structure, changes in their cognitive development. They can have a difficulty in completing their schoolwork because they have a short attention spans, or they may be considered to be hyperactive because they're in that heightened state of arousal. As a result of this, it's not uncommon to see lower scores on measures of verbal, motor, and social skills, on different test measures. And children, as a result of witnessing domestic violence and intimate partner violence, learn destructive lessons about the use of violence and power in relationships. So they learn that it's acceptable, again, going back to Bandura's social learning theory, they learn by observing the adults in their environment that it's acceptable to exert control or to relieve stress by using violence, or that violence is in some way linked to expressions of intimacy and affection. But he says that he loves us, and he says that if we would just listen, or if we really loved him, then we would listen to him. Because we're not listening to him, he loves us so much that he has to do this, or she has to do this. And so they learn that this is linked in some way to expressions of intimacy and of affection. Children's responses to domestic violence, intimate partner violence, really depend on the severity of the violence, their proximity, how physically close they are to the violent events, and the way that the adults and the caregivers respond in that instance immediately following the event, and how that the caregivers respond and interact with them. Okay, now we are going to look at some of the, again, reactions and responses that we see of children, depending on developmental level, to exposure to domestic violence, to intimate partner violence. For birth to 5 years of age, it's not uncommon to have the child again experience sleep and or eating disruptions. They may also withdraw from interactions from others, maybe because they're anticipating that physical violence and that pain and disappointment. They may also again experience intense separation anxiety because they don't want to leave the non-offending parent because they're afraid for their safety. They can also exhibit inconsolable crying, very difficult to comfort. And then again, going back to some of the challenges when a child has experienced trauma, it does have the potential to impact them developmentally. So it's not uncommon to see developmental regression, or if they've just newly acquired a skill, having a loss of that skill. They exhibit intense anxiety because they're in that heightened state of arousal. They're always waiting for, that blow or that shoe to drop. They also, again, will exhibit increased aggression or impulsive behavior, difficulty in regulating the emotions again. So you'll see that with each of these different types of trauma, that there are some consistencies with regards to response and behaviors of the children. So just to be aware of that, but then also be aware of those key pieces that differentiate them from one another. Ages 6 to 11, this is the age group that also exhibits some nightmares and sleep disruptions because they're afraid to go to sleep, or when they go to sleep, they replay that trauma in their dreams. They have challenges with their peer relationships because they have a difficulty in regulating their emotions and their behaviors. Again, difficulty with concentration, focusing, and memory. They can also withdraw from interactions because, again, they're anticipating the rebuff and the pain that's associated with relationships. And so because of challenges associated with focus and attention, this contributes to poor school performance, which may cause the child to avoid school and increase the likelihood of truancy. And then ages 12 to 18, we may see the child, again, because of difficulties in regulating emotions and challenges in developing attachment, engage in antisocial behavior. Again, consistent with ages 6 to 11, we can also see, because of changes and challenges with regulating emotions and keeping focus and attention and memory, that this contributes to school failure. So challenges in completing tasks at school, completing homework, maybe even attending school. They're more inclined to engage in impulsive or reckless behavior, again, because of changes in the brain, and some of it may be as a result if there is child abuse as well as domestic violence in the home, if there's a physical injury to the brain, as well as the body's response to the trauma. If there's been repeated domestic violence in the home and it changes that child's brain development, again, knowing that it's going to affect those decision-making parts of the brain, which would contribute to that child's increased engagement in reckless behavior. And so we can see it manifested in all of these different ways, where they may be depressed or they may be anxious, withdraw from interactions, withdraw from things that they previously enjoyed. And so we want to be sensitive to that, be aware of that. There are, however, some things that can be done to support the child and the family to turn the situation around. And so we always have to be looking again for those strengths, the strengths of the non-offending parent, of other members of the family to be able to step in and intervene and support that child, making sure that we're using opportunities that we have to identify strengths that the child has so that we can promote those and help the child to recognize that they do have a purpose and have value, and that they are good at something, and that they have something to contribute, and that they have a lot to share, and that they do have that purpose. So for children, interventions can include groups or individual therapy, as well as treatment with their non-offending parent. So doing what we can to enhance and promote that parent-child relationship with the non-offending parent. Because sometimes there might be anger towards that parent for being in that situation, or wishing that the parent had left. There are also times where, because children are so they're so absorbent of their environments, where you may actually start to see that child starting to engage with the parent in the same way as the offending parent. So there might be a need for some intensive treatment with that regard as well. An essential component of intervention with all children is really doing what we can to support and strengthen the relationship between the non-offending parent and the child. So again, coming from a family systems perspective, coming from a family-centered care perspective, doing what we can to enhance and support that relationship. So for most children, a strong relationship with the parent that's non-offending is a key factor in helping that child heal from the effects of domestic violence. And so we want to do what we can, as with almost every case and every type of trauma, we want to do what we can to support that parent-child relationship, which we do normally in the hospital environment, but it's going to be of even more so importance when we're working with children that have experienced all of these different types of trauma that we're going to discuss and that we're discussing now, so that we can do what we can to support them and lead to those positive outcomes. Do you have any questions? If you have any questions, again, please don't hesitate to reach out. I do also want to make sure that I share this resource with you. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is absolutely phenomenal for different resources to support children that have experienced trauma. They also have some resources specifically related to pediatric trauma, which relates, to like medical trauma, not pediatric trauma. It's all pediatric trauma in terms of the resources they have available, but they have medical specific resources for children that perceive their healthcare experiences as trauma, and how we can lessen the potential for psychological upset in the hospital environment, which again is an ultimate goal of child life. And so you may want to go to their website and just check out what resources they have available. They have some PDFs that you can download and print that you can save to your computer. And there are also times where they have webinars that you can access to support your knowledge and to help you dive a little bit deeper. I do hope, again, that this is helpful for you. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I look forward to our next conversation. Have a great week.